First lessons from Matthew chapter 6, verses 31 through 33. Jesus says, don't worry, saying, what will we eat, or what will we drink, or what will we wear? For it is the Gentiles, which means the rest of the non-Jewish world, who seek all these things. And indeed, God knows that you need all these things. But seek first the kingdom of God and God's righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. And then also in Matthew's gospel, a little further on in the 11th chapter, verses 28 through 30, Jesus says, come to me, all who are weary and who are carrying heavy burdens, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Here ends the reading. So Matthew 6:33, which is one of those verses that I encourage people to memorize. I'm not big on, Bible memorization, but it's nice to have a few key verses that you commit to memory so that it's just like they're in the bank when you need them. Romans 8:28's one. All things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to God's purposes. It's good to know that when you're in the midst of something hard, God's going to use this. Doesn't mean it was caused, but God will use this to do something beautiful. It's always true. But Matthew 6:33 says, to seek first the kingdom, or as I prefer to translate it, I think it's a better word nowadays to say the consciousness of God. Put God first. Put your spiritual life and your spiritual condition first. If we do that, then according to the Bible, our sacred text, everything else that we need will somehow be given to us. It will find us somehow. And that's what the Bible in countless places tells us to do. I'm not going to water that down. The only legitimate place on a priority list for us as followers of Jesus for God is at the top. It's just the way it is. And that's what the song Don't Wait was really about. Make God your number one priority. Let there be some urgency in your spirituality. I recently heard someone say that everything you want lies on the other side of your fear. Putting God first means trusting that God will give you what you need to go right into what you fear the most, if you know God's calling you to, leading you to do so. And this is where it gets exciting, actually. Your spiritual life will come alive. Just found my pick. It will become the great adventure if you put God first. Don McFarland, who was the founder of the organization through which I started traveling to Haiti many, many years ago, it's a man that Harriet Taylor and I both worked for. He founded that organization, and he used to love to quote from the theologian Alfred North Whitehead, who said, without the high hope of adventure, religion inevitably becomes the mere appendage of a comfortable life. Isn't that a great quote? Without the high hope of adventure, getting out of the comfort zone, religion inevitably becomes the mere appendage of a comfortable life. So there should be some effort in our faith journey. Challenge, commitment, some invitations to get out of the comfort zone, take some risks in response to God's radical love, even when it hurts. There's a time to let the Spirit push us to be open to love, even when there are lots of reasons to play it safe or to get even. I mean, Jesus' teachings to love your enemies is no small thing. The call of God almost always involves some risk, stepping into things where you don't feel adequate, trusting that if God's leading you and you're putting God first, that, quote, with the assignment comes the equipment. You'll be given the resources, all of them, whatever they are, that you need to do what God is asking you to do, but often not ahead of time. And often they're only drawn to you once you start moving, taking action. When you make a commitment to saying not just, yes, I will do it, but I'm doing it. Or kind of like Yoda in Star Wars when he says, no try, do. It's not easy or even natural sometimes to show up in the so-called real world or real life as someone who's putting God first. It's often not our first human inclination to do things in a God-first kind of way. Last week, on Thursday evening, the youth group, teenage youth group, and I went mini golfing at Vitens Golfland in Madison. I don't think there is a God-first way to do that. That course itself cheats, but I'll take that up with Vitens. But afterwards, they came back to my house for a cookout. And we had some burgers and hot dogs, and we're sitting around, we're talking with each other. And one of them mentioned that during the last week of school, someone used a racial slur against this person, used the N-word. And so we started talking about that, and I was just listening. I didn't bring it up. It wasn't part of the program. Just came up in conversation. The kids are talking about it. And one of them said, well, you should have just beat him up. And someone else says, yeah, you should knock the, what out of him. At which point I figured the minister better interject. And I said, not to sound obnoxiously like a pastor here, you guys, but this is a church event. And you think maybe there's another way that you could creatively respond to this situation. And they're like, yeah, but they deserve it. And I'm like, okay, yeah, but, what does your faith say? And one of them said, well, maybe we could, or could have, school's over now. But if it happens again, maybe we could organize a meeting and have everybody who believes that that's wrong go out on the front lawn of the church and sit down together and have a sign that says, we want a school that respects everybody. I said, that's a great idea. That's what we're talking about. And I said, and if you do that, if you want me, I'll come sit with you. There's a time when they don't want the adults around. It's better off they do it themselves. But I know a lot of you would too if we were invited. There are often creative alternatives to the first inclination to just hit back or whatever when we put God first. And I want to encourage you, whatever you might be up against in your life personally, or regarding an issue that you care about deeply, to seek God first, to show you a creative, love-centered way of responding instead of just reacting. And trust God with it, and don't wait. All right, now, the rest of the message is to move to the other side or another side of pretty much everything I just said. And this is why I shared with Blake, that there's effort and there's ease. There's easier stuff, there's harder stuff. It all counts. Showing up and doing something now, sometimes that's the harder part. Spiritual journey is always a both-and thing. There are often at least two sides to one coin when it comes to sacred truth. There are often paradoxes and tautologies, and really what I'm saying now is also a part of the adventure of seeking God first, but in a very different way. The truth is that even when you're deeply, radically, joyfully committed to putting God first, as I know some of you are, to seeking the consciousness of God, the truth is that even when you want that more than anything, you're not going to be able to do it perfectly. In fact, the more committed you are to seeking the light, the more aware you will become of your own shadow. The brighter the light, the dirtier the window. And learning to embrace this truth, how to live joyfully and peacefully with our own imperfections, is one of the best parts of the adventure of faith, and also one of the reasons why, even though I love many spiritual traditions, I keep coming home again and again and again to Jesus, not because he's better, but I just find stuff there that I don't necessarily others, maybe because I'm looking deeper there. But Jesus says, more than anything else, don't be afraid. That's his most commonly repeated phrase. 365 times in the Gospels. Interesting number. Don't be afraid. You can look at the truth, even a truth about yourself that you don't want to see, or aren't thrilled with, or are downright frustrated with. So, seek God first. Don't wait. Give it all you've got. Have some urgency. But when you're weary and you're frustrated, first and foremost with yourself, then come to Jesus and say, look, this is all I got. And he will say, as that beautiful scripture says, I know you. I know you're not perfect. Stop trying to be perfect. I got you. Jesus knows, and God knows, that we lose ourselves all the time. It's impressive, isn't it? Our capacity to get sidetracked and lost. Not because we're evil or bad to the core. Very, very few humans are that lost. But because we're human, which by definition means we don't always do the right thing. That's part of what those first few chapters of Genesis are telling us. You humans often don't do the right thing. And why? Well, that's another sermon for several other days. But we don't. At least not with as much consistency as any of us would like. It's hard being human. Well, the Buddhist teacher, Tara Brach, tells a great story about how easy it is for us to lose ourselves and just get thrown off, get sidetracked, distracted. It's the opposite of being consciously mindful. Buddhists call it slipping into trance. It's a great story. There was a woman in a town in Montana where Paul Newman had a house. And she had a big crush on Paul Newman and his amazing blue eyes. And she'd heard that he had a house somewhere in their area, but she'd never seen him. He wasn't there that often. But one hot summer day, she decides to stop into her favorite sweet shop for an ice cream cone. And she walks in, and it's a small place, and there are a few tables. And sure enough, the only other person in the place is Paul Newman sitting down having a cup of coffee and reading the paper. And she was starstruck. She almost turned around and left. She didn't know what to do. But she figured, no, I can do this. I'm going to keep it together. I'm not even going to look at him. He doesn't need locals bothering him. That's not why he's here. I'm going to just not even let him know I notice him. Play it cool. She orders her ice cream cone. She waits, and while she's waiting for the cone, she just can't help herself, and she takes a glance at him. At which point he looks up and right at her with those blue eyes, and she pretty much fell apart. Somehow she got through it. She gets her ice cream cone, takes some money out of her purse and pays for the ice cream cone and gets the cone and gets her change and somehow manages to get out of there. And she's, okay, and gets to the car, at which point she realizes that all she has in her hand is the change. And no ice cream cone. She's like, oh, okay. So she goes back in. And she goes, I must have left it on the counter or something, or maybe I didn't take it out of his hand. I don't know. She goes up to the counter, at which point Paul Newman stands up and walks over to her, and he taps her on the arm, and he says, "It's in your purse." Part of the adventure of seeking first the consciousness of God is making peace with the fact that even when we desperately want to, we won't always. So I'm going to quote with three of my favorites in closing. Nadia Bolz-Weber puts it this way: I say no when I should say yes. I say yes when I should say no. I stumble into holy moments not realizing where I am until they're over. I love poorly. And then accidentally, I say the right thing at the right moment without even realizing it. Then I forget what matters. Then I show tenderness when it's really needed, and then turn around and think of myself way too often. I need a place to confess I don't have it all figured out. Christianity is not a program for avoiding mistakes. It's a faith for the guilty. There's no right or perfect way to be. We learn from our mistakes. We extend grace to others and ourselves in the same way a lover who loves your body allows you to have grace for it. So is grace the antithesis of rejection. Richard Rohr, for those visiting, he's one of my favorites, Franciscan priest. He says, I'm sorry to report that working with our shadow, what some call shadow boxing, continues until the end of life. The only difference being that we're no longer surprised by our surprises or so totally humiliated by our humiliations. As we age, we come to expect various forms of half-heartedness, deceit, vanity, or illusion from ourselves. But now, at least we can start to see through them, which destroys most of their game and their power. And we can smile at ourselves and our imperfections and begin to do what some call romancing the shadow. And finally, James Finley. He had Thomas Merton as a novice master when James, at a younger stage, was a monk. He left that, became a psychologist, got married. He says, so we live in our faith. He's in his 80s now. We bear witness to it through love, and we live in hope. And as the Apostle Paul says, now as in a mirror darkly, then face to face. And this is our way. But the kind of unpleasant thing that must be acknowledged is that we often don't do a good job at this. In other words, beginners, which is really all of us, well, there's a lot of slippage in the beginner's life. Because we all have wayward hearts. We're strangely exiled from a childlike, visceral, intuitive understanding of our groundedness in God's love. And in that estrangement, we act out that ignorance upon ourselves and upon one another. There's a traumatized state of consciousness in which it acts out that trauma upon itself and upon one another. There's way more there than we're going to unpack. That's why we get the feeling that if this is all up to us, it's not going so well. But Thomas Merton said, you know, we're all walking around with a little list in our hearts that once I stop doing this and this and this and this, then God and I will really get down to business. You know, once I start doing this or stop doing that, but then the years go by. Years go by and the list is still there. And senility and enlightenment are in a race to the finish line. And you're concerned. You're concerned. And Merton says to realize that with God, there's no list. There is no list. God doesn't even ask that you add to your list to get rid of your list. because God knows you can't tolerate being unconditionally loved as unexplainably precious in your fragility. And this is Christ. That only love is real. The real sadness isn't that we slip and fall. The real sadness is that we give more authority to our brokenness than we do to the infinite love that loves us through and through and through, as unexplainably precious in our brokenness. This is the good news. So, seek first God's consciousness. If you know God's asking you to do something, don't wait, don't play games, do it. But as you're living out trying to seek God first, and you find yourself lost or in a trance, feeling like a hypocrite, tempted to beat yourself up because after all this time you're still wrestling with the same stuff, then pause and let Jesus walk up to you. And don't be afraid to spiritually look into Jesus' eyes as he smiles at you and says, "It's in your purse." Amen.